So hello, everybody. I am Howard Friedman. I am the director of the Jewish Community Library, which is a program of Jewish learning works. And I want to welcome all of you to today's event with Professor Marc Dollinger. I want to thank the Friends of the Jewish Community Library for making what we do possible. I hope that you will consider becoming a friend of the library at www.friendsofthejcl.org. I also want to thank the Ingrid Tauber Philanthropic Fund for supporting our programs. And I want to thank our co-presenter for today's event, Hamakom, the place. We have virtual programs happening at the library all summer and fall. You can find these events by going to www.jewishcommunitylibrary.org, and I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. Before we start today's program, I want to go over some quick ground rules. Because we do have a very large number of attendees, everybody is going to be muted during the program except for Professor Dollinger. However, we invite you to make use of Zoom's chat function. You can use it to introduce yourself and make any comments. We're hoping to have time at the end for questions and answers. So if you do have any questions, please do write them down in the chat and I will relay them to Professor Dollinger, time permitting. I'm encouraged that we have so many folks here today who are committed to furthering their engagement with issues of race, particularly at this difficult moment in our history. And I'm so glad to have in our community a scholar of such great ability and commitment who can help us deepen our understanding. The German philosopher Schopenhauer noted that most of us carry with us the Jocasta in our hearts, who begs Oedipus, for God's sake, not to inquire further. One of the things I appreciate about Professor Dollinger is that he insists on inquiring further. He's an historian who searches for the truth, not for a story that is going to make us feel better. Dr. Marc Dollinger holds the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility at San Francisco State University. He's the author of 4 scholarly books in American Jewish history, most recently, Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. He also sits on the California Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. It's our great privilege to have him with us today, and I'll now turn over the virtual mic to Professor Dollinger.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share screen here, and we can get started. The murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police has sparked the largest, most diverse, sustained, grassroots civil protest since the 1960s. In terms of our nation's grappling with its racism, this could be the most significant moment since Reconstruction ended in 1877. As we all pause, reflect, learn, and act, let's take a fresh look at an old problem: the relationship between white Jews and systemic racism in what was first British colonial North America, and then, of course, the United States. Since you're here watching, I assume you've already paused and reflected. This is the learning part. My hope is that this knowledge, even consciousness, will give you a better sense of how American Jews fit into our larger national scene today. And with that knowledge, I hope it will inform your next steps. First, our setup for today. This will not be a happy lecture. For those of you who have attended my lectures before, I like to tell jokes and be funny. This is not today. I am not striving for balance or fairness, however you describe that. I'm not here to give both sides. We have a single specific goal today: trace the relationship between American Jews and racism from 1654 to the present. This is a postgraduate seminar of sorts. And just to let you know, I've done this a few times, and each time I get a communication or two after the fact, and typically it's a critique, and the critique is along the lines of, you know, you should have told the other side, you should have been more fair, you should have been balanced. So I'm here to tell you that's not happening today. We're here looking at that specific question. It assumes that you've already heard and probably know the story of American Jewish success, of social mobility, of achieving the American dream. And I should say, because I know a bunch of you who are here today, if your learning is already to the point that you understand the subtle ways in which racism plays out, Please have patience. I'm going to spend some time walking us through some new ways of understanding even how we define the term. So today we're going to investigate 3 different expressions of racism in American Jewish history. First, we're going to look at times when American Jews actually embraced racist thoughts. Those would be the most offensive. Then we're going to look at times when American Jews were complicit in racism, maybe a step down, but still concerning. And the biggest picture for us, and probably the biggest surprise for many of us, times when American Jews benefit from racism, whether they knew it or not. So let's start with whiteness. Today I'm going to be focusing on white Jews. There is a whole debate about if Jews are white, if white Jews are white. That's another talk. If you're interested, check Facebook, I'll be giving those. Here's my definition for today. If you kind of look like me, I'm going to call you white, and we're going to move on from there. And that's because the experience of African-American Jews and other Jews of color amplify what we're going to learn today. They offer perspectives I cannot give in our understanding of American Jewish history. So even as we work through a white-centered view today, I encourage everyone to read up. There are so many articles and op-eds and publications. Just go to social media and you'll find a lot. Read up all you can. I do have a bibliography, which I'll forward to Howard and to Noah with a few of my favorites too. For today though, and in response to our national reckoning, my focus is on white European American Jews, how we experienced history and how it shaped our perspectives today. So thank you so much. I'm honored to be back at the Jewish Community Library. Howard, Noah, and they have an entire tech team here helping in the background. And I'm just going to give, Howard, I didn't tell you this, I'm going to give you a pitch. I am a friend of the Jewish Community Library. I have been for years. It's an outstanding organization. I just encourage everybody to sign up as well and to continue to support these kinds of lectures. For those of you who've ever been in my class, I always like to offer the historical question for today and my thesis. So today we're going to ask the question, how and why have white American Jews supported, complied, and benefit from systemic racism? My thesis, the process of becoming American over time and place encouraged Jews to embrace the political and social culture around them. Regardless of time or place, that meant participation in racist systems. White Jews leveraged their privilege to achieve extraordinary success on American shores. While it is an important and heartwarming story, Jews' disproportionate participation in social justice causes did not negate the influence of their whiteness in their impressive rise. My career thesis argues that Jews tend to follow the political culture of the society around them. And today what I'm going to do is take that thesis and apply it to race. So we'll start with a little sociology. We'll make this an interdisciplinary day. Sociologists who study race have described a repeatable and predictable pattern of behavior among many whites when it comes to engaging racism. And part of our lesson is facing and even working through that sociology. Yes, it's called white fragility. White fragility is the idea that white people are fragile when confronted with even talking about racism. So today, on behalf of all of us who are white Jews listening today, I'm going to assume white Jewish fragility. When you feel it, acknowledge it, take a deep breath, and keep listening. You're probably aware of Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. It's close to the top of the New York Times bestseller these days, and I, of course, highly recommend it. I'll be introducing some other sociological phrases and ideas as we go. All right, but first, a preview. Dare I say, a prediction of what your responses could be today. This is called yes, but. So here's how yes, but works. Yes, but that was a long time ago. Things are better now. Yes, but that was in the Deep South. What do you expect? We don't live in the South. Yes, but that was only one person. Most Jews didn't behave that way. Yes, but you picked that document on purpose. Go pick better documents. Yes, but there are other documents that say the opposite. Okay, that's true, there are, but that's not the point. So let me talk about yes, but. It's a very powerful technique. It's powerful because you are absolutely right. Every single yes, but is certainly true. And for that reason, it gives us a wide open doorway to walk through. And once we walk through that door, we never have to look to see what's outside. That doesn't make the outside go away. It just gives us white folks the opportunity to ignore it. So yes, but is a privilege that white Jews enjoy. It reinforces the supremacy of whites. Yes, but is a piece of the thread that weaves together systemic racism. So once again, yes, but will happen. It's hard to avoid it. So when it does, think back to those moments of white fragility, name it, acknowledge it, and can keep listening for the deeper meanings that we would miss otherwise. Okay, so becoming American, this will be the thesis for today. Over time and place, Jews have worked to become American. This is a familiar story, I'm sure, to most of us. Jews learned English, they changed their religious practice. In many cases, they changed their names. And one more thing they've also done in becoming American is racism. In becoming American, sometimes in places, meant being outright racist. It meant taking action or not taking action that made Jews complicit in racism. And it certainly meant benefiting from racism. So here's how we're going to work today. This is a primary source document reader that I co-edited with Gary Zola. And what I did is I just opened up to chapter 1 and I just pulled out the race-related documents in the book, and I just put them up on PowerPoint in order to create this. And the meaning here is nothing you're going to hear today is new. Everything that I have has ostensibly been taught, because this book is generally adopted in American Jewish history courses, at universities throughout the country. All I've done instead is just picked out the race-related ones, put them next to each other, and then offered sort of a unifying thesis to make it all make sense. So an important points here, in many cases, and this is just to get us ready, Jews didn't have to try to do any of the racist things I'm describing. They just happened. And that's because the American social system itself was built on white supremacy. If you're white, you win. We often think that racism demands intent. At least when I was growing up in the 1970s, I was taught if you support the KKK or the White Citizens Council or Jim Crow, you were racist. And if you loved Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you were not racist. And that was the beginning and the end. And of course, what many of us are learning now in recent weeks is that racism just happens. And Jews as Americans are in the middle of it, especially as we moved up the social mobility ladder. So we'll start our history here in Recife, Brazil, in the 17th century, the 1600s for the historically challenged. What did it mean to become American in colonial America? How would Jewish immigrants act in their new surroundings? When and where did racism intersect with Judaism? So here's the background. About 2,500 Jews lived in North America on July 4, 1776. Some say as many as 5,000. There weren't too many. They were most all Sephardic. And they lived in port communities along the Atlantic coast, Charleston, Newport, Savannah, of course, in addition to New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. What was important about the Jewish population, the Sephardic Jewish population that was so small, is there were other Jews in Europe, in England, in the Caribbean, all across the transatlantic region, which meant if you were in business, let's say you were just a Christian business person and you needed a ship and you needed to move things across the Atlantic, you tended to trust the Jewish merchant because you knew that they had ethnic, religious, even family connections with one another, and you could trust them because if one of them, screwed you, then everybody would get thrown out of the family or thrown out of the business. So here's our first document then. This is from 1713. It's a letter from Abraham Chaim de Lucena to the governor of New York, Robert Hunter. And the situation was that there was a boycott of a naval boycott of Jamaica. And here we have a Jewish shipper who has a ship that has to get to Jamaica, and he doesn't want to break the law. So what is he going to do? He is going to write a letter to the governor asking for permission based upon whatever reason he has, so he can follow the law and continue to be a good business person. So what if the cargo going to Jamaica wasn't just goods? What if the cargo coming from the Caribbean or Africa back to North America included Africans destined for slavery? What's the Jewish thing to do then? What's the American thing to do? What's the right thing to do? I suppose we could always ask ourselves, what would we do in this situation? And I'd like to think that we would be anti-slavery and absolutely refuse. But guess what? In this era, it was the law of the land. The colonial economy was built on slavery. The triangle slave route, if you remember learning about that from school. The entire shipping industry relied on the transport of Africans into slavery. So sure enough, colonial Jews did the job that they needed to do. And here we have it. This is a document from 1762 from Isaac Eliezer and Samuel Moses to their captain, John Peck. And what I've done is I've highlighted the piece that I'll read. And it says, and here's the instruction from the Jewish merchant to the captain, that you embrace the first fair wind and proceed to sea, and make the best of your way to the windward part of the coast of Africa. And at your arrival there, dispose of your cargo for the most possible can be gotten, and invest the net proceeds in as many good, merchantable young slaves as you can, and make all the dispatch you possibly can. Wow, well, Professor Eli Faber wrote a book. So basically, Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam were contending that Jews controlled the slave trade, that they were disproportionately involved in the slave trade, and these were based on terrible anti-Semitic tropes. So Professor Faber wrote an entire book to really the entire story of this. I'm not making the claim of that at all. I'm making an Americanization claim instead, which is to say, from our earliest days on American shores, some Jews did engage in the slave trade, because on a larger scale, our community's financial success was built, at least in part, on them doing that. This was systemic. It was woven into the fabric of the colonial economy, and therefore it was woven into the fabric of American Jewish life as a result. Oh yeah, one more thing. If you've been looking closely at this document, and you can read small print in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see this ship came from Rhode Island. This didn't even come from the South. So now we begin to even diminish the North-South boundaries when it comes to slavery and racism. So what did it mean to become American in Rhode Island in 1762? What if you earned a comfortable living? Would you own African and African Americans in slavery? And the answer is you would. But how would you self-reflect on your slave ownership, right? How do you reconcile what you just did with your Judaism? If you have to choose between enjoying your status as a white Southerner, or even in this case, Northerner, who could own slaves, against your obligation as a Jew who is supposedly opposed to slavery, what would it look like? So for this, I just want to let everybody know, the next document contains the N-word. I will not be saying that. It does appear in the original document, and I just want you to be aware of that. All right, this is Maher Josephson to Michael Gratz concerning a female domestic. It's from 1762 as well. And here's a selection that's highlighted. If you come here for the coming Sabbath Nachmu, it would please me very much, because we are presently very lonesome on the Sabbath. I also inform you that I may sell my N-word, wench, at a profit. So if a ship with N-words should arrive, or a ship with indentured Germans, you will let me know, because I cannot manage without a servant. The wench I now have has two virtues, both bad ones. First, she is drunk all day when she can get it. And second, she is mean, so that my wife cannot say a word to her. She is afraid of her. How did all this happen? A free N-word here wants to court her and to buy her from me. I don't want to give her away for less than 110 pounds with her bastard, because I bought the bastard too. Signed, your affectionate friend, the humble Maher, son of Joseph. Wow. All right, first of all, this was a typical letter, at least from Josephson's perspective, because he just wrote this as he wrote it. This letter integrated Jewishness. He wants them to come for Shabbat. He knows the Parsha. He doesn't like to be lonesome on Shabbos. And then, of course, for me, that closing salutation, affectionate friend, the humble Meir. Wow. Meir embraced the privilege of his whiteness. It was offered to him by the white South. It was conferred. So comparing this to today, the part that connects this awful moment with us is acculturation. That's a sociological word. The process by which we become part of American culture. Acculturation shows how deeply we embrace the American culture around us, how the worst examples of racism happen even if we're believing Jews. It shows how the realities of white privilege create really uncomfortable moments for us as Jews. Our challenge and opportunity today, of course, is to survey our lives and see how racism in America today informs what we are thinking and what we're doing. So let's move to the early national period. I like it 1776 to 1820. Whoever made this slide has a different argument than I. But here we have the Declaration of Independence, promising life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all. The Constitution, which came a decade or so later, promised to realize the promises of the Declaration of Independence into law, except, and here, of course, we're hearing and knowing more about this recently, most of that only applied to white, literate, landed men. And Jewish men in the early republic were just that. And this created complicity in a racist system at the very least. So this is the last will and testament of Samuel Jones. It's from 1809. And here's a portion of his will. After my funeral expenses and my lawful debts are paid, if I should not emancipate my Negro woman Jenny and her son Emmanuel during my lifetime, it is my desire that my executors do emancipate my Negro woman Jenny and her son Emmanuel, and give to Jenny my bed sheets, bedstead, blankets, tables, pots, plates, chairs, looking glass. To my Negro woman Jenny, $200. To Jenny, I leave also the income of the leases of $100 per year to be paid to her quarterly. And it is my desire not to drive Jenny and her children out of my house in King Street unless they have time to procure a place for their abode. What's our analysis of this document? Jenny is getting more money than any other person or any other organization if you want to read through there. Jenny's son is even getting money. Jenny gets his bed sheets. Why his bed sheets? Because Samuel Jones is the father of Emmanuel. This is how academic historians are reading this document. Jenny cannot consent to sexual relations. This was rape. Today, we know it's wrong for men in the workplace to have sexual relationships with subordinates. We know if there's any sort of power differential, it's a problem. This was slavery. Jenny wasn't a citizen. She wasn't a person according to the law. This could not be romantic love. And in the yes, but argument, if this was love, Samuel would have freed her in his lifetime, and he didn't. If it was love, Samuel would have moved with his family out of the South to the North, maybe homesteaded in the Midwest, maybe moved to the Caribbean, go to Europe, anywhere, anything where they could live together in peace, and he didn't. While we think being Jewish makes us different, I argue that in America, we tend to be more the same than we like to think. Becoming American encourages us to copy those around us. But what's wrong with raping an African-American woman you own in slavery? Thomas Jefferson fathered multiple children with Sally Hemings, and she could not consent. And he was the one who wrote the Declaration of Independence. In a sense, we could say Jewish slave owners were just like Jefferson. With our founding fathers, our nation's quintessential Americans owning slaves, who could expect American Jews to call them out and act differently? That's how deep racism went. Civil War. Slavery is wrong, and un-Jewish. Judaism says, tikkun olam, repair the world. My two favorite Hebrew English words. Our rabbis take strong social justice positions, sometimes with dissent from members of their own congregations. And you know where this is going. This is a sermon by Rabbi Morris Rafal, and it's called The Bible View of Slavery, a Discourse. And I'll read a part of it. This is the story of Noah in Genesis 9:25. You and I may regret that in his anger, Noah should, from beneath the waters of wrath, again have fished up the idea and practice of slavery. But that he did is a fact which rests on the authority of Scripture. I arrive at the conclusion that next to the domestic relations between husband and wife, parents and children, the oldest relation of society with which we are acquainted is that of master and slave. When you remember that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Job, the men with whom the Almighty conversed, all these men were slaveholders, does it not strike you that you're guilty of something very little short of blasphemy? My friends, I find, and I am sorry to find, that I am delivering a pro-slavery discourse. I am no friend to slavery in the abstract, and still less friendly to the practical working of slavery, but I stand here as a teacher in Israel, not to place before you my own feelings and opinions, but to propound to you the Word of God, the Bible view of slavery. The result to which the Bible view of slavery leads us to, first, that slavery has existed since the earliest times. Second, that slaveholding is no sin, and that slave property is expressly placed under the protection of the Ten Commandments. And third, that the slave is a person and has rights not conflicting with the lawful exercise of the rights of his owner. All right. So here's the shocker, if that's not enough of a shocker. If you look closely at the print, this rabbi was from New York City. In fact, he was from Congregation B'nai Jeshurun. And for those of you who follow the synagogue scene, you'll know that B'nai Jeshurun is one of the most progressive, enlightened synagogues in the country. They're leading in so many synagogue initiatives. And here we find out in 1861, it was their rabbi that was offering this biblical defense. This, once again, was not a regional thing. Judaism doesn't necessarily preclude systemic racism, and our American Jewish historical experience has been rooted in and framed by racism going back centuries. So we'll turn now to Isaac Maher Weiss, probably the most important Reform movement rabbi of the mid-19th century. He was, one of the founders of many Reform Jewish institutions. And in 1867, just 2 years after the Civil War ends, he took a trip to Richmond. And here he took a diary. He published a newspaper called The Israelite in Cincinnati, so he could publish his diary. And here is his description of the post-Civil War South and what he thought was going to happen for the future of the South. As inevitable as fate, the 11 Southern states are to belong to the Negroes. The enfranchisement of the Negro and the disenfranchisement of so many white men places the destiny of those states entirely in the hands of the Negro. The next consequence will be that as many white men as will possibly be able to sell out will go to the North. This again is as inevitable as fate, for the Southern man will not submit to Negro rule 1 minute longer than he must. The longevity and prolification of the Negro in that climate gives him a natural advantage over the white race and must in time press it from those states. The next consequence of the emigration of the white will be a new immigration of Negroes from Africa. 11 Negro legislatures, the representatives of 11 states in Congress, the thinly populated country, the want of labor, the better climate than the Africans, the good government and the rich country take all these circumstances together, and you cannot deny that the Southern states in the course of 25 years will be a new Africa. The South will never be what it was. Her cotton trade is ruined. The white people will leave as fast as they can. That is the end of it. We're all linked to the culture around us. Becoming American extends even to our highest standing clergy. For Rabbi Isaac Maher Weiss, freedom of former slaves conflicted with his view of the America that he wanted to see created. So we'll move now to the Industrial Revolution, 1880, 1920, late 19th, early 20th century. Even though Reconstruction ended in 1877, systemic racism continued, just in different forms. Sharecropping replaced slavery. Lynchings maintained the terror of slave times. Poverty crimes invalidated the 13th Amendment and began what would become mass incarceration. While we typically think of this as a white and not Northern, as non-Jewish rather than Jewish, the institutionalization of racism in this period knew no boundaries either. And let's talk about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. Most of us are aware, sadly, about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory because they had a horrific fire in 1911 that killed 146 people, mostly Jewish women laborers. And we typically learn about this story as a labor story. That is, unsafe working conditions led to the fire. Lack of exits led to the deaths. All of it built on a capitalist system that preyed on new immigrants and women who needed the work. Jews were leaders of that union movement that helped them. All good, right? Well, not so much. Triangle Shirtwaist, we knew this was a class problem because it was about rich factory owners and poor immigrant workers. We knew it was a gender problem because it was Jewish women facing the worst of those working conditions. But it was also a systemic race problem too. They used cotton to sew in all of those New York City factories. The cotton came from the South. The white landowners who sold the cotton got it from exploiting black sharecropping farmers. The Northern economy could not operate without a reliance on a racist Southern economy. And here is another complication. Okay, in 1885, there were 241 textile factories in New York City. Of the 241 textile factories, 234, almost every one, was owned by a Central European Jew. Management, in the labor management split that we would have studied in this period, management was also Jewish. This labor problem was really a Jew versus Jew problem. This is what becoming American meant for Eastern European Jews in turn of the century New York. And this is certainly not what we remember. It's not what I learned when I first learned the story, right? Our historical memory, what we remember and what happened are often different. We erased the intra-Jewish part of the story, and we erased the sharecropping economic racism part of the story. We turned the story into Jews leading the labor union movement. But it got worse. Even when Jews supported labor, it was done in a racist way. This is from 1919. This is Rabbi Stephen S. Weiss. Stephen S. Weiss is most famous for creating the Free Synagogue in New York. In the 1930s, he would become personal friends with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Famously or infamously, he was one of the first American Jewish leaders to learn about the Shoah, the Holocaust. FDR asked him to keep his mouth shut for 4 months so they could figure out if it was true, and it was true. And Rabbi Weiss is sometimes getting critique for keeping silent. He was one of the leaders of the American Zionist movement. And I say all this to say that this, again, is not a random marginalized rabbi. This is another Rabbi Weiss, as it turns out, who was at the center of his generation of rabbinic leadership. And I won't read these out. I'll just explain to you that there was in labor unions, there was a question between the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, and the IWW, the International Workers of the World, known as the Wobblies, if you know labor history. And he had to figure out which side to, which union to join. He joined the AFL, right? IWW was communist. It was too far to the left. It, it didn't look good, right, for American Jews, or shall we say white American Jews, to sign up with a communist labor union. Except the AFL was racist. There were some chapters that weren't, but certainly National didn't stop those that were exclusive of black laborers. The IWW was inclusive of all labor, regardless of race. So here we have a moment where labor unions and race and Judaism all came together. The New Deal of the 1930s. It was, well, Depression was a bad time for everybody, but the New Deal was really good. FDR brought more Jews into the federal government than any other president before him. And when it came time to dealing with the Great Depression, he brought in Jewish ideas on poverty, Jewish social workers. In fact, Isaac Rubinow, who was a Russian Jewish immigrant, wrote parts of the Social Security Act of 1935. Prior to that, in 1930, he was presenting to a Jewish social workers conference. What do we owe Peter Stuyvesant, who was the Dutch colonial governor of New Amsterdam, later New York? The idea was when American Jews came to America, the expectation was they would take care of themselves and not become a burden on the public government. And now by 1930 even, Rubinow wanted to make the case it was time for American Jews to understand that they were part and parcel of the United States, enough that they should rely on the government to protect them. So here's what he wrote. Jewish poverty is not a result of intergroup conditions. It is a part and parcel of the whole economic and social problem of wealth production and wealth accumulation of the country as a whole. The expectation that the problem of Jewish poverty can be met individually may be hoped to be eliminated irrespective of the general economic factors. That's an expression, he said, of excessive group pride, uncontrolled by scientific thinking and research. You see, for Rubinow, becoming American meant being treated just like every other American. Well, unless you were Black. You see, to get support from the South, FDR decided with his New Deal money that he would let the Southern politicians decide how to spend it. And of course, they gave the money to the white South, not to the Black South. In fact, you may be aware FDR was not so good on race. It was his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a whole lot better and let him know. America's racist political system doled out money to Jews, to white Jews, when it wasn't to Blacks. And of course, you know, this is benefiting from, because the American Jews certainly didn't want that to happen, but it did because it was reflecting systemic racism. And here we have the numbers of Jewish organizations that were getting funding from the federal government. And you can see, you know, using 1929 as the base, by 1932 and 1933, the Jewish agencies had double the money that they had just a few years earlier because they benefit from the New Deal programs. African Americans in the South, not so much. So let's go to the post-World War II era. This was once again a great time for American Jews. Anti-Semitism was plummeting between 1945 and 1960. There used to be anti-Semitic housing covenants in the suburbs, and those through the 1950s declined and ended. 500,000 American Jewish women and men were GIs in World War II and enjoyed the GI Bill that gave them lots of new opportunities for everything from home loans and college applications and small business loans. We became American. Yay for us, except Levittown. Levittown, created by a Jewish real estate developer, first in Philadelphia, there were others on the East Coast. The idea here was you could build tract homes on huge pieces of land outside of American cities. And now with cars becoming much more available, people could commute back and forth. Or even they could get a new job in the suburbs because jobs were appearing there too. Now there was bigger house for less money for more people. And well, here's the oral history of one of the Jewish residents of Levittown. It was the talk of the Jewish community in Philadelphia, because who would think of buying a house with $1,000 down or $500 down? Levittown became a heavily Jewish-seeking area because immediately Levitt gave a beautiful piece of property to the conservative synagogue. Eventually, they gave ground to the Reform synagogue too. I never experienced any discrimination in Levittown because I'm a proud Jew. But as a matter of fact, my mission is to educate not only Jews, but the Christians. Most of my friends who are Christian, I teach them Bible, so I don't hide the fact that I'm Jewish, unquote. No discrimination, he said, except Levittown, as you're probably guessing, was racially exclusive. Discrimination he was talking about is a code word for anti-Semitism. He, as a white Jew, had no discrimination from white Christians. But you see, when Jews moved to Levittown and other suburban locations for the first time, they signed the covenants that excluded Blacks. And even after the US Supreme Court overruled that, there were still informal ways in which neighborhoods were white or stayed white. Here is a case when the American dream was also complicity in racist housing. To be sure, Jews were not intending on being racist. They were intending on achieving their dream of home ownership. And the moment they did it, they jumped over blacks on the social hierarchy ladder in order to live in the suburbs. And once they got there, supporting home ownership also meant supporting racism. The JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Council National Group, used to be called the NACRAC and NCRAC. And in 1955, they wrote the following report about what was happening. Some cities in the United States have lost more than half of their Jewish population within recent decades in the mass movement to the suburbs. In many cases, the Jewish families for the first time find themselves in neighborhoods that are predominantly non-Jewish in character. This creates a new and fruitful basis for the bettering of relationships and the furtherance of mutual acceptance and appreciation. Meanwhile, new groups have moved into the neighborhoods formerly occupied by the Jewish families that have moved to the outlying suburbs. These newcomers generally are of lower income levels and often comprise groups that have been the victims of discrimination in housing. Frequently, they are Negroes or Puerto Ricans or other racial minority groups. In this case, mutual acceptance and appreciation, as they said, applied only to white Christians. Jews maintain ownership of apartment buildings and businesses in cities even after they moved to the suburbs. Those prophets built suburban synagogues and JCCs in what was, in the 1950s, the largest Jewish communal building boom in American Jewish history. Communities of color interacted with Jews largely as their landlords or business owners. This, I argue, is part of the breakup of what we would call the Black-Jewish alliance. Supporting your family business meant supporting racism, because all too often the profits that came from those businesses did not go back into the communities that were paying for those services. All right, so this is, from an intellectual point of view, this is my favorite document. You know, none of these can actually be favorite based upon the topic, but this is 300 years, the 300-year anniversary of American Jewish history. This is from something called a film strip. Some of you might remember having film strips in school. I actually do. And here we have the March of Americans. From the very beginning, of course, there's no indigenous people, which is part of the point. You start with a pilgrim. And then after the pilgrims, I think you can see Thomas Jefferson perhaps there. And then there's if you can see, that looks like Davy Crockett to me. And then it keeps going back until ultimately 1654, when the first Jews arrive, or maybe the 1850s with the Central Europeans, or the 1880s with the Eastern Europeans. See, this tells all of the Jews who are watching the film strip that Jews are real Americans. And Jews, by this point, are definitely self-defining themselves as white. They are putting themselves literally in line with this particular history. They have now fully integrated themselves. African Americans would not have this film strip on their 300th anniversary. Jews of color wouldn't have this as their film strip, to put a point on it as well. What are the consequences for Jews to internalize a pilgrim origin story on our sense of ourselves as Jews, on our sense of ourselves as Americans? Supporting a multimedia presentation about American Jewish history, in this case, meant supporting a racist system that built the country. All right, this is from 1947. In 1947, the United States Congress was considering federal support for public education with the Cold War. And this is testimony in 1947 to the Senate Subcommittee on Education. And here is the testimony. A segregated system is not merely an unfair system, but it is a wasteful and inefficient system. Nevertheless, we do not believe that a federal law to equalize educational opportunities by public subsidy should be used to attack the segregated school system. So long as the law guarantees that states having segregated school systems do not discriminate financially against children in the minority schools, We believe the bill should be supported. All right, so for any and all of the attorneys who are out there, we'll start in 1954. 1954 was a Brown decision. The Brown versus Board of Education decision said that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. Here we have testimony that says, so long as the law guarantees that segregated schools don't discriminate financially, it's okay to have them. So this testimony is against the Brown decision. If you're a really good, smart constitutional law lawyer or judicial or Supreme Court, you would know, tell whoever you're listening with, it was the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson. That was in railroad cars, but the Plessy case said that separate educational facilities were equal as long as they got the same amount of money. First of all, they never got the same amount of money. And second, if they did, we know it wouldn't be equal. Who said this? Of course, you know it's going to be a Jewish person. Yes, Rabbi Stephen S. Weiss. Rabbi Stephen S. Weiss, now I'm going to defend him for a moment and then ultimately reveal where the complicity in racism comes in. He went down from New York to DC to testify for public schools. That's a very rabbinic thing to do. But after he gave his testimony, the Southern white bigoted racist Jim Crow senators went up to him and said, we're not going to have federal dollars to our schools because we know the moment you put a federal dollar in our schools, you're going to mess with Jim Crow. And we won't let you do that. So they said to Rabbi Weiss, they're going to put an amendment to the bill. And the amendment's going to say that all the federal dollars will not touch segregation. And they said to the rabbi, we need you to support this. Otherwise, they said to the rabbi, this bill will never leave committee. And in that moment, and under that kind of tension, he said a segregated system is not merely unfair, but wasteful and inefficient. He had to say that, right, for morality. And then he understood that nevertheless, he made the compromise. And he made the compromise in what sociologists call liberal gradualism. That is that liberals understand that they can't bring all the change that's needed at once, so it's good to do it gradually, step by step. It's better to have some kids get some money than no kids get no money, and we'll deal with Southern Black kids later. Well, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was probably a little too young in 1947 to be there, but let's just imagine he was offered that deal. Would he have taken it? I can't imagine he would have taken a deal to guarantee that racial equality would not happen in the South. In fact, by passing the amended bill, the federal government doubled down on its Jim Crow. And that reveals Rabbi Weiss's privilege, his ability to be a gradualist, and his ability to, if you want to be cynical, sell out Southern Black kids in order to get whatever he could get for the white kids. And that is part of the intrinsic systemic challenges that faced Jewish leaders, even as they were doing the best possible thing that they could do for America and for the Jewish people. So this is from 1963. It's going to be a pop quiz for any of the rabbis who are here. And I know Rabbi Zarin's here, so I'm going to continue to wish you happy birthday throughout the whole year. Let's imagine you're a rabbi from the North. And in this case, Rabbi Richard Watergrand was a conservative movement rabbi. And he was at the Rabbinic Assembly annual meeting in '63. And a bunch of the rabbis said, you know, we're tired of just passing resolutions on civil rights. If we're really, really committed to racial equality, we should end this convention early, get on planes, go down to Birmingham and march with Dr. King. And about a dozen of them did. And when they got there, they were met by Southern Jews. Yankees go home, they said. And they were screaming at them, right? That they didn't appreciate that they were there. So the question is, you're a Northern rabbi, you're committed to civil rights, you're going down to march with Dr. King. What do you tell a white Southern racist Jew who's opposed to integration? Here's what he said. I was not fully convinced that we had a right to place the Jewish community of Birmingham in a more dangerous position than we were willing and able to place ourselves. In weighing the morality of this particular aspect, the scales were very even. How could that possibly be? Of all people, a Northern rabbi cannot say from a moral point of view, the scales were very even between being a racist Jew and a non-racist Jew. When I read this first in my doctoral dissertation research, I spent the rest of my dissertation trying to figure this out, and it's basically become my career thesis. I think Winograd got the thesis for today's talk, that if you're a Southern Jew, you're going to be racist in the way Southern whites are. And if you're a Northern Jew, the same. And he had some humility to understand when he went to the South that this was, and I didn't highlight it, but you can see it on the right side at the end of the opening paragraph, a circumstance which had led to pitting Jew against Jew. He was mostly sad that he as a rabbi had divided his own community. So I carry with Rabbi Winograd this sense of empathy and understanding that getting sort of self-righteous, no matter what region, place, or thing that we did, is probably an overstatement. This is not from the book, but I wanted to put it in. This is part of the handwritten copy of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. It's a very famous document. Many of you have probably heard about it. And what you may not remember or know or been taught when you learned it is this actually wasn't so much about fighting for the civil rights movement as it was about fighting against white moderates. And by taking to heart what Dr. King wrote from Birmingham jail, it gives us a sense of even more of the thesis as we're moving now into the 21st century. And here's what he wrote. I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. When I was suddenly catapulted into leadership of the bus protests in Montgomery, Alabama a few years ago, I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. This is the challenge we face today. How much have we as Jewish social justice advocates followed the pattern King described? This is the definition of racism as not being anti-racist. It is a call to action. Good-hearted liberalism means complicity in racism. I'll move away from the history reader to include some documents from the contemporary period. Since the civil rights movement ended, the fight against racism came north. Whites-only neighborhoods now, but without Jim Crow laws. Whites-only schools now, but without Brown decision challenges. When integration and busing came, Jews pulled kids from public schools, put them in private schools, or even opened Jewish day schools for them. When Black power demanded real equality instead of just legal rights, Jews turned to fighting for Soviet Jews instead. When Jews faced anti-Israelism, anti-Zionism, and sometimes even anti-Semitism from a new generation of Black activists demanding change, they retreated from the front lines. They built their own Jewish ethnic revival instead, even fighting for Jewish causes supporting racism. It all came crashing together in the Black Lives Matter movement. Some Jews oppose Black Lives Matter because some of its leaders are anti-Zionist. An anti-Zionist statement was included in the nearly 40,000-word statement. Many Jews have demanded a retraction of anti-Zionism as a condition for their support. We tell people of color to change their views, or we'll take our ball and go home. We are leveraging our white privilege, our power, to force African Americans to change their views. And we're holding all African Americans accountable for what only a few are saying. We get to make these demands only because America has privileged us to be in a position where we have enough power that we matter. Let's not tell other people what they have to think. Let's not use the power we got as whites to tell blacks they need to be more like us. Let's not miss the point. This is about Black lives. Instead, let's join together for racial justice. Let's show our willingness to leverage our power for the good. Let's develop long-lasting relationships from our good work. Then we can talk about why Zionism is so important to us. Otherwise, we'll only alienate even more African Americans who are disappointed that white Jews are inserting conditions into their social justice mandate. We'll be in a much weaker position when we want and need allies ourselves in the fight over anti-Semitism and even the fight over Israel and Zionism. A good place for us to start is among Jews of color. Their absence from organized Jewish life reflects the many subtle and not so subtle ways that racism permeates our synagogues, JCCs, and other Jewish organizations. Do white Jews ever get asked or demanded to explain how they became Jewish? Do white Jews ever get asked to be served another helping of Shabbat dinner? Do white Jews ever get told that their very synagogue name tag doesn't belong to them? Jews of color rejection of organized Jewish life is our problem. We created it and we perpetuate it. How welcoming are our synagogues if a black or brown Jew has to think about how they're going to make an approach to an armed guard or even an unarmed guard? How much are we losing because our lived Jewish communities don't include the 15% Jews of color that are expressing their Judaism elsewhere? While humanity and Judaism demand that we address systemic racism for our fellow Jews, for Jews of color, we also need to understand that we're addressing it for ourselves and for the whole of the Jewish people. We lose if we don't get to live in our diverse community as it exists today. To end on a hopeful note, the Nechemta for today, this moment offers an opportunity for a new approach to racial justice. By seeing what has been invisible to us in American Jewish history, we can begin to see what has been vivid for African Americans and other communities of color. By letting go of our closely guarded version of American Jewish history, we can begin to see the backside of our social mobility, the negative consequences of our successes. That knowledge, that consciousness is where we need to be to start the process of dismantling a system that privileges white Jews over communities of color. In the best possible way, we can prove Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail wrong while we prove his vision of a diverse America right. So I will switch off the screen share and thank you for receiving this history and for the reflections that will follow.
Thank you so much, Professor Dollinger. So I encourage people, so Professor Dollinger is willing to take questions, and so I encourage people to put those questions in the chat. I know it's been an active chat with some disagreement. I wouldn't expect anything less than disagreement among Jews, and particularly around difficult issues. But I'm just going to share some of the questions with him. So the first is the question of, somebody asked, how do we vociferously support Black Lives Matter without giving tacit approval to the Free Palestine movement?
Yeah, so that's a good question. By the way, that's my #1 question. It always comes up, not always first, but I always get it. This is sociological code, in other words. So I would disagree with the assumption that supporting Black Lives Matter is giving tacit approval. And I would say that making that connection is itself a reflection of the challenges that we face. And if we sort of were to flip it or invert it, I don't think that we would make that claim or that cause if it were flipped onto the Jewish side. So, by the way, I'm a scholar and academic. I'm an historian. My joke is it's tough enough to predict the past. How can I predict the future? That said, I have been, actively engaged in these questions. And what I'm getting from those in the Jewish progressive activist community is that you need to be proximal, to take Brian Stevenson's phrase, and show support. And that way we are humanizing. And then as a product of those kinds of relationships, when anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism or anti-Israeli policy stuff comes up, you're actually then in a position to be able to engage and talk about it. The notion that we would not even begin a fight for racial justice because there are some in the Black community who are anti-Zionist or even anti-Semitic is you know, now I'll just speak personally, right? I don't go for that at all. I'm like, if we're in for racial justice, let's do that and be in for that.
Thank you. Somebody asks, in your opinion, is the Jewish community generally more or less racist than non-Jewish white communities?
Oh, that's such a good question. All right, so, oh wow, that's really good. So here's the thing about American Jewish exceptionalism. And now I'm gonna disagree with my own thesis. Jews are the most liberal white ethnic group in America, second most of all time, meaning African Americans are the only ones who in 2- and 4-year elections vote for liberal, now Democratic candidates. So in that sense, we are exceptional to other white American groups, and the data is clear. The challenge with that is when we as Jews use that historical frame in order to congratulate ourselves and go home. The extent to which systemic racism does not actually demand us to affirm any racist beliefs, that it simply means operating in the privilege conferred upon us without even trying, means, and now I'm going to give you a radical leftist critique, and this is what Dr. King was arguing from Birmingham, the worst thing are liberals. Because if you've got a KKK racist, at least they're owning it and admitting it, and then you know if you've succeeded or not. But what we have with liberal gradualism is a sense of how great we are. We did all that help in the 60s, and then we go back to our white suburban homes, and we're done with it. So the easy answer is yes, we're better and different. The hard answer is I wrote this lecture for the express purpose of really making all of us uncomfortable and not going to the exceptionalist part. I just ignored the exceptionalist part because I really wanted to focus on where the whiteness came. And I want to just give a credit to all of you here and say that I've been doing this for 25 years. I never would have written, I wrote this lecture like 3 weeks ago, you know, when all this happened. I never would have written this thing in an earlier period. I never would have given it because 5 of you would have shown up, 4 of you would have complained to the rabbi. I'd never get another job at that synagogue again. And now we got 253 people coming to hear how Jews are racist. And that to me is probably the best trailing indicator that we as a community have our eyes and our hearts and our souls wide open to this and to hear it. So I want to offer gratitude for your listening as I push back against attempts to sort of make it all right by talking about how great the Jews were in the 50s and 60s. There's lots of great books if you want to read that. And then when you're done, come back here.
Thank you. So there's a question. Could you talk about those who present counterexamples to your thesis, even if your thesis generally holds?
So you want to make an argument against myself? Is that the question?
That is the question.
Okay, so I want to say that's a brilliant question. And anytime one of my friends says to me, some professor said something they really don't like and they don't know what to say back, and I'll tell it, this is your hint. Go to that professor and say, if you're in an academic conference and you're on a panel, what is the other panelist going to say against your thesis? And then just sit back and listen, because they're obligated to know what the counter argument would be. Ultimately, I think the counter argument here, and I think the real question we're all facing, is whether or not liberalism is a viable ideology for social change. Gradualism tends to be the way we as white Jews have operated. Move slowly, piece by piece, make friends, politics, all the different ways so that year by year by year we get better to the goal. The more radical leftist critique is anything short of revolution is not going to bring change. And the argument after the murder of Floyd and after all of the civil unrest, which you could call riots or you could call democracy, depending on where you're landing on it, was the thing that got 249 of us here, because 4 of you have had enough, I appreciate that. And now we're talking about it. So I think the critique of my thesis is whether or not liberalism works. And those who find it to be failing are going to move to a more radical direction, if only to move the center more to the left as a product of doing that. And then there's another one, which is that we have segments of the American Jewish community who are not on the political left, who are not liberals. And as you all know, we have groups that are supporting Trump and Trump's policies. And this group would reject me outright. They would reject most of the premises and the idea of liberal pluralism and liberal democracy as a goal. They would be more nationalist in their look, and they would be less concerned with what's going outside the Jewish community and more concerned about what's going on in and among Jews. That would be sort of the Israel right or wrong, Israel only argument when it comes to Zionism.
Thank you. There's a question about the question, did we move more slowly because of fear of anti-Semitism?
All right, yes. Eric Goldstein, in his book, The Price of Whiteness, which I recommend, it's the best academic work on Jews and whiteness. It was originally his dissertation at the University of Michigan. In The Price of Whiteness, what he does is he starts in the 1870s, he goes to the 1970s, and he talks about how white Jews were not considered white. And, for a lot of American Jewish history, only in the 1950s did we start being called white and getting those privileges. So what he argued was that Jews, because of anti-Semitism in the 20s and 30s, would not support African-American equality because Jews were not in a position to be able to do it because they were fighting anti-Semitism. Only when anti-Semitism eased in the 1950s were American Jews then able to go across the divide to help African-Americans. So in that case, we see that anti-Semitism, did bring that down. It gets flipped now because, well, actually, there's been two periods. One is up to 3 or 4 years ago, and then before that, because before that, anti-Semitism was not having an appreciable negative impact on Jewish social mobility or sociology, where racism was and is. Of course, now we've had the most horrific instances of anti-Semitism in American Jewish history in the last few years with the synagogue shootings. And this is bringing to the fore Jewish vulnerability around anti-Semitism against, at least in my case, Jewish whiteness. And how do you navigate being a victim at the same moment you're navigating the conferred privilege you have? And intellectually, I love this as a Jewish studies professor and as one who studies this, because I think white Jews are like the best case to be sitting in so many places simultaneously trying to wrestle and navigate with it.
Thank you. Someone asks, many Jewish friends of mine always bring up the comparison of slavery to the Holocaust. How do you handle that kind of dialogue?
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's a sad joke, but I'll just say it, because it came to mind. Jewish studies professors, we have a little wager going when we do community lectures. And the wager is how long before someone brings up Hitler, Nazi, the Holocaust in the 1930s, because it comes pretty quickly, So read the question again so I can think about that one.
Many Jewish friends of mine always bring up the comparison of slavery to the Holocaust. How do you handle that kind of dialogue?
All right, and it's like, generally I don't like it because this is the Olympics of oppression, and what's undergirding even the question is like, who got it worse, right? And I just don't think that goes anywhere well. If from a social justice perspective, if you're asking from an academic perspective, I would say the goal of the Shoah, what was called the Holocaust, was genocide of the Jewish people. In a matter of just a few years, 90% of the Jewish population of Poland was gone. The goal of slavery was a centuries-long system of racial oppression, of economic oppression, which has lasted, of course, centuries even after slavery ended. That would be the essential difference between the two. But my general thesis is that I find that comparison more challenging and troubling than helpful.
Someone asks, can you speak about the relationship between Jewish institutions and police? I feel that the heavy ongoing presence of armed guards and police-based security in synagogues and JCCs definitely helps perpetuate racism in Jewish community spaces.
All right, thank you. And I'm gonna go back to I'm gonna do a large thesis and then get to the police. 1945, let's just pick that year as the worst year in Jewish history, because that was the year that the Shoah, was revealed. If you're going to argue that Jews are the most powerless people on earth, 1945 is a good year to say that is true. And if you're going to say Jews aren't white, Jews are not white in Nazi Germany. By definition, we were subhuman, and that's what legitimated the genocide as self-defense. 3 years later, the state of Israel is born and a Jewish military is created. And I know we're being recorded, but I do have tenure, so I will say the state of Israel has the nuclear bomb. Rumor has it they have 200 of them. So the Jewish people now collectively have more power than any group of people can ever have in human history, because we could destroy the world. Now, I know they didn't get the bomb in 1948, but just for the sake of argument, let's talk about total powerlessness in 1945 and the beginning of ultimate powerfulness just 3 years later. I think we as a post-Shoah generations of American Jews are reconciling the trauma of those 3 years of moving that quickly. That some of us are stuck in 1945, some of us are stuck in 1948, and a lot of the disputes we're having, revolve on that tension. And this is where the police come in. Because when we have JCC bombings threatened and we have shootings in synagogues while Jews pray, we are brought back to the moment of greatest powerlessness we have had in terms of fear. And we need protection. Yet, as now I'll say white Jews, in largely, for me it's a suburban synagogue, a lot of you probably not, but bringing in armed guards and fortressing synagogues, not only is that antithetical to the welcomingness of Jewishness, but now we are making an unintended consequence on Jews of color. Because for white Jews, that police officer represents the resolution to 1945. And for Jews of color, that police officer represents, the institutional racism that has Black men dying in the streets. So that's how the police officer becomes symbolic of this difference on race, but literally then becomes the same thing as helping and hurting simultaneously in some of the deepest and most profound ways. And that's a hard one.
Thank you. This is a long one. Do you believe the relative economic success of Jews in America, maybe aided by what people call white privilege, has helped create anti-Semitic feeling among Blacks? If so, do you believe such jealousy or anti-Semitic feelings are held by a few or many Blacks? And is your suggestion, in any case, that we support African Americans and maybe this will change how they feel about American Jews?
Okay, a lot of pieces to that question. So first I'm going to push back against the very phrase Black anti-Semitism, and I've used it in a couple of my books. Because let's just say anti-Semitism, right? And let's just say anybody who's espousing anti-Semitic beliefs. The way sociological code works and the way it's a challenge is as soon as particular groups get associated with the word anti-Semitism at the exclusion of other groups, then it becomes sort of an opportunistic platform in which to, in which to go. Evan Traylor, who is a first-year rabbinic student now at HUC, worked on the national level for the Union for Reform Judaism, a leader in the Jews of color community, just put up on Facebook sort of 5 or 6 questions on why you should never say Black anti-Semitism. And since I have published the word Black anti-Semitism, I'm owning it myself. I read it this morning. I encourage all of you to look up Evan and read it. So it's very good. So taking that aside, and my current book is on anti-Semitism from the political left and right. Now I got to reach out to Evan and find out, can I call it right wing and left wing, or is that's making the same problem in a different way? So let's speak generally. Do Jews getting more power promote anti-Semitism against them? No, they don't, because that's blaming the victim for their own oppression. So we don't do that. And whoever the anti-Semite is, whatever they're coming from, if they're anti-Semitic, they're anti-Semitic. And if they're claiming it's because Jews have power, then that's their problem, not our problem. And that needs to be addressed. So I went to Poland with our daughter Shayna. Our family went before her bat mitzvah. And in this market in a little Polish town where there were no Jews, there was a little stick figure of a stereotypically looking Jew holding coins and a little fiddle, like Fiddler on the Roof. And it was as anti-Semitic an image as I could imagine seeing. So I asked our Polish translator to ask the person what that was. And they said, "That's a Jew." I said, "Yeah, I know, but what's with the coin?" And he said, "The Jews are really rich." I'm like, this is getting worse. And I'm like, what does that, what does that mean? He says, "Well, Polish people want to be rich and lucky just like the Jews. So we buy this and we put it in our house so we can be rich and lucky too." Right. Now, oh my goodness. My first book was Quest for Inclusion, and it basically traced the rise of Jewish power from the 1930s to the 70s. No one had done that before, so I was excited because you always, in grad school, want to have a topic no one's done because you'll get published and get a job. Only later did it realize that the reason no one had written the book is I talked about Jewish power, and there had been a reluctance from the generation immediately after the Shoah, the Holocaust, to write scholarly books that talked about how much power Jews had. Because if you took a paragraph out of my book and a non-Jew read it, you could call them an anti-Semite. But in fact, it's actually true. Jews are disproportionately successful when it comes to money and power. And that's anti-Semitic. So how on earth do we navigate truth in history against a trope which has been really bad? I'll just leave it there.
Someone asks, could you speak about the Jewish radical tradition, those self-identified Jews who differentiated themselves from liberal gradualism on the left?
Okay, so more bad news for a lot of the people who are here. The three top reasons given incorrectly for why American Jews are involved in progressive politics and the civil rights particularly is one, blacks and Jews have a common history. In fact, they don't. As an African-American colleague of mine said, he was head of the Black Jewish Dialogue in New Jersey, he said, if I go to another Passover Seder and someone tells me they know what it's like to be a black man in America because they too were slaves in the land of Egypt, I'll scream. African-American history and American Jewish history could not be more different. The second argument is sociology, that blacks and Jews are both marginal groups, therefore they should join together, except that as Professor Goldstein teaches, Jews didn't join until after they weren't marginalized. And here's the third part. The religion of the Jews commands that Jews get involved in social justice. And that's a tikkun olam argument. And if Judaism says so, it should have been the Orthodox who were most active in the racial justice movement of the 50s and 60s. The Orthodox were absent because they didn't consider racial justice a Jewish issue. The conservative movement was almost absent except for Rabbi Heschel, of course, but Rabbi Heschel was all but excommunicated by his own rabbinic peers at the seminary because they didn't like it. The reform movement was the most active of the denominations, but here's where the radicals come in. Most of the activists who were Jews were going down with secular civil rights groups, and they were socialists, and some of them were even communists. And there is an inverse relationship between political persuasion and social justice. The more communist you are, the less you're into organized religion, the more you're into radical protests. So this sort of compounds the historical memory issues in the organized Jewish community of self-congratulations.
Thank you. One question about clarification. Could you repeat the name of, Evan's name, his full name?
Traylor, Traylor.
Okay, we'll send something this week, and then it'll have a link to that article to the people who did register for the event, as well as other resources. Someone asks what you think about the case for reparations.
Yeah, so by the way, we are now walking away from American Jewish history. As a scholar, I just have to say it, and they're your questions, so I will answer your questions as me, but this is not based on my research. Absolutely reparations, and there's two pieces to it. One, of course, the obvious parallel for Jews is Holocaust reparations from Germany. So we do in the Jewish community, have a model. But second, and this is where sociological code comes in, what does the word reparations mean? The instant knee-jerk reaction is, I'm not writing a check to a black person because I wasn't a slave owner, and then they're done with the word reparations. Of course, if you read some of the literature on it, and just go on the internet because there's tons of good stuff, you find out that what reparations is really about is finding creative ways to remedy the systemic injustices which have been perpetuated over the centuries since slavery ended. And in fact, we have done different pieces of reparations, in previous years of liberal or progressive reform. I haven't done a lot of reading on this, but from the reading I have, it's just like really smart people who are quite subtle in understanding how the systems operate, what you need to do to change the systems, and once the systems work out better. I'll give just one anecdotal example. I went down to Alabama back when you could go to places like Alabama, and gave some Black Jewish talks. And we had like a party that night. An African-American businessman walks up to me, non-Jewish guy, and he said to me, do you want to know how you can make a better Black-Jewish relationship going forward? And I said, I certainly would, you know. And he said, capital, Jewish capital. He said, I'm a businessman. I have trouble getting access to capital as is a systemic challenge in American banking for African Americans. He said, Jews, and this is true, I did not take it as anti-Semitic at all. In just 2 or 3 generations, Jews have done very well in business, very good with accumulating capital, and have done very well. How about having Black-Jewish partnership, sharing capital in order to work on projects that are going to be supporting the African American community, where both communities get the profits and both communities get aided and supported by flipping what was going on in the 50s and 60s when the money was sort of going one direction out of Black communities. And that could be seen as a form of reparations in my mind, at least.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So I think we're going to conclude. And I just want to really thank you and thank everybody for joining us. This is really, for me, it's very meaningful to have people, even if we disagree on issues, that's part of what it takes, I think, for us to show up at the table and discuss these issues and confront them directly. And so I appreciate you sharing your research and your perspectives. Professor Dollinger, is there anything that you would like to leave us with?
Just with appreciation, especially for those who found this even more discomforting. I'm sad to say that is a trailing indicator of success. And it's to say that this, I must own this myself in my own work, even that term Black anti-Semitism, which came up this morning. So I'm in too, and I thank you and I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody. We will send something to everybody who registered with further resources, including links to the book, to the American Jewish History, the documentary history that includes all of the documents that Professor Dollinger did share with us today. So thanks everybody. Be well, be safe, and we'll see you soon.